The snow fell not like flakes, but like ash, a cold, gray dusting that coated the Laramie Plains in a shroud of finality. It had been falling for 3 days, burying fences and silencing the world until the only sounds left were the ones inside your own head. For Nora Quinn. The dominant sound was the hard, dry cough that echoed from her mother's room, a sound like dead leaves skittering across frozen ground. The other was the groan of the windmill, its blades locked tight with ice, protesting the wind's ceaseless assault. Inside the small sod house, the air was thick with the smell of rendered beef tallow and boiled herbs. The fat had hardened in its pan on the cold stove, a pale, unappetizing disk. Nora dipped a cloth into the lukewarm water of the basin and gently wiped her mother's brow. Maeve Quinn's skin was nearly translucent, her breath a shallow puff of mist in the frigid air. Her eyes, once the color of a summer sky in Galway, were clouded with fever.
"How are you feeling, Mama?"
Nora asked, her voice quiet. Maeve's lips barely moved.
"The winter has deep teeth this year,"
she whispered. A spasm of coughing seized her, and when it passed, Nora saw the faint, terrifyingly bright fleck of red on the handkerchief. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Nora's heart, a colder threat than the wind whining outside. She tidied the worn blankets, her hands moving with a competence that belied the tremor within her. At 22, Nora had a woman's responsibilities and a girl's dreams, and the two were at war. The farm, inherited after her father's lungs gave out to the dust of a drier year, was a losing battle. The debt to Ephraim Bly, whose sprawling cattle ranch bordered their meager 160 acres, grew like a cancer. Bly had made it clear last month, his words polite, but his eyes as hard as river stones, that if the loan was not serviced by spring, their plow and team would be his. Without the plow, the land was worthless. They would be adrift. For 6 months, Nora had placed her hope in the United States mail. 12 times she had paid the fee to have her notice printed in the Matrimonial Times, a paper that circulated from Cheyenne to the mining camps in the West. A respectable Irish girl, 22 years of age, literate and skilled in all domestic arts, seeks a husband of good character, can keep a clean home and a good ledger, owns a small property in the Laramie Plains. Please write to Nora Quinn. General delivery. Laramie, Wyoming Territory. Each letter she composed was a small, polished stone of hope, carefully worded to sound capable but not desperate, lonely but not pathetic. She imagined a man, a good man, reading her words by lamplight in a bunkhouse or a distant cabin. A man who was tired of being alone, who wanted a partner, not just a drudge. She had mailed 1 letter every 2 weeks, walking the 5 miles to town to hand it over the counter to Postmaster Pike. And for 6 months, the vast, impersonal silence of the prairie had been her only reply. She bundled herself in her father's old wool coat and wrapped the blue woolen scarf her mother had knitted for her tightly around her neck. The wool was a defiant speck of color against the monochrome landscape. Hope, her mother had called the color. "The town needs supplies," she told Maeve, forcing a cheerful tone. "And I will check the mail." Maeve's eyes closed. "Be careful of the drifts, Nora girl." Nora fought her way through the snow, following the line of fence posts that was her only guide. The world was a blinding swirl of white. The silence was immense, a physical weight that pressed in on her. Faith, her father used to say, is a sturdy horse, but Nora's faith was beginning to limp. Was the mail simply slow, bogged down by the relentless winter, or was it something else? A cold knot of suspicion had been tightening in her gut for weeks. Was her advertisement simply being ignored by every single man in the territory? It felt unlikely. Her proposal was a sound one. The property, though indebted, was a start. She was not a beauty, but she was strong and not unpleasant to look at, with her dark hair and her father's determined chin. Laramie was huddled under the storm, smoke rising from its chimneys in straight, gray pillars. The post office was part of the general store, a long, dim room that smelled of coffee, leather, and damp wool. Postmaster Pike sat on a high stool behind the counter, a small man with a perpetually damp-looking mustache and eyes that shifted away when you tried to meet them. He was sorting a meager bundle of mail that had come in on the morning stage. "Morning. Nora," he said without looking up.
Vicious weather. Is there anything for Quinn, Mr. Pike? She asked, stamping the snow from her boots.
Pike made a show of looking through the wooden cubbyholes behind him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each letter weighed 5 pounds.
"No, nothing today,"
he said, his voice flat. "Mail is all tied up east of Cheyenne. This storm, you know." Nora's heart sank, the familiar thud of disappointment. For 6 months, he had given her the same answer, with different excuses. The heat, the rain, the railroad strike, and now the storm. She lingered, pretending to look at a bolt of calico. She watched him. He had a habit of palming small items, a piece of hard candy, a stray postage stamp. When he thought no one was looking, he was a man of small, greasy secrets. She thought of Ephraim Bly, the man who held their debt. Bly was a powerful man in the territory, a man who owned not just land and cattle, but men like Pike, too. The thought was a sudden, chilling certainty. She needed to buy flour and laudanum for her mother's cough, but she waited. She saw Deputy Hale come in, shaking snow from his hat. He was a man who walked a fine line in Laramie, a lawman who understood that justice was often a matter of negotiation. He nodded to her, his gaze lingering for a moment with something like sympathy. "Trouble with Bly's men again down at the saloon," he said to Pike, his voice low. "Nothing serious, just reminding them whose town this is." Pike just grunted, not looking at the deputy. Hale bought some tobacco and left, and the store was empty again except for Nora and the postmaster. It was then that she saw it. Pike had turned to get a sack for a new customer who had just entered, and for a moment, his back was to her, tucked into the wrong cubbyhole. One meant for the railway office, was the corner of a familiar brown envelope. It was wedged in so tightly it was barely visible. It was not the type of envelope the railroad used. It was the type a man might buy at a general store for a personal letter. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She had to know. While Pike was busy weighing out beans, his attention wholly on the scale, Nora moved with a swift, silent grace. She edged along the counter, her back to him, as if examining the selection of threads. Her hand darted out, quick as a striking snake. Her fingers closed around the edge of the envelope and pulled. It came free with a soft rip of paper. She slipped it into the deep pocket of her coat, her whole body trembling. She paid for her flour and medicine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely count the coins. She did not dare look at Pike. She felt his eyes on her back as she walked out the door, a feeling like an insect crawling on her skin. She did not stop until she was a mile out of town, hidden from the road by a stand of snow-heavy pines. The wind howled through the branches, but she did not feel the cold. Her hands, clumsy with a mix of fear and desperate hope, pulled the letter from her pocket. It was addressed to her, Miss Nora Quinn, General Delivery, Laramie, Wyoming Territory. The handwriting was strong and clear, the letters black against the brown paper. In the top left corner was the name of the sender, Cade Walker, Medicine Bow Relay Station, and slashed across the front of the envelope, in a bold, damning purple stamp, were 2 words, Return to Sender. Nora stared at the words until they blurred. Cade Walker. She did not know the name, but that did not matter. What mattered was that a man had written to her. A man had answered. He had sent a letter from Medicine Bow, 100 miles to the south, and it had come all the way to Laramie, only to be stopped here, in this cold, corrupt office, and sent back into the silence. It had not been the slow mail. It had not been a lack of interest. It had been theft. Postmaster Pike had not just withheld her mail. He had stolen her future. A hot, furious anger surged through her, melting the icy despair that had encased her heart. This was not just about a letter. It was about the 12 letters. It was about her mother's life, about the farm, about the right to make her own way in the world. It was about the countless other women whose hopes were being sorted and sold by a man with a damp mustache. She looked at the purple stamp again. Return to sender. It was a lie. The letter had never been returned to Cade Walker. It had been hidden. Pike had not even bothered to send it back. He had just stuffed it away, confident in its oblivion. He had underestimated her. They all had. When she got back to the sod house, the lamp was lit. A small, brave flame against the growing dusk. Maeve was asleep, her breathing shallow but even. Nora sat by the fire, the purloined letter in her lap. She did not open it. The seal was unbroken, a testament to the fact that its contents were meant for her and her alone. To open it now felt wrong, like reading the last page of a book first. The how and why of its message could wait. The first step was to undo the crime that had kept it from her. She looked at her mother, at the blue scarf hanging on a peg by the door. Hope. It was not a passive thing. She realized it was not something you waited for in the mail. It was a choice. It was a journey. She stood and began to pack a small satchel, a change of clothes, the last of their bread and jerky, the small pouch of money she had saved from selling eggs, and the letter. She tucked it safely inside, a secret promise. Her mother stirred as Nora bent to kiss her forehead. "Where are you going, child?" she murmured, her voice foggy with sleep and laudanum. "To get an answer, Mama," Nora said softly. She put on her father's coat and wrapped the blue scarf around her neck. She opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back, but she leaned into it. Her face was set, her eyes fixed on the unseen horizon to the south. She did not know a Cade Walker from Medicine Bow, but she was going to find him. And she was going to find out who had tried to keep them apart. Her journey would not be one of waiting, but of seeking. She would follow the path of this stolen letter back to its source and reclaim the answer that was rightfully hers. The snow fell like cold ash around her, but for the first time in a long time, Nora Quinn felt the flicker of a fire inside. The United States mail coach was less a vehicle of progress than a cramped, rattling box of cold misery. Nora paid her fare to the driver, a man named Lyle, whose words tumbled out of him like coins from a torn purse, and found a seat at the very back. The leather was cracked and cold enough to steal the warmth through her heavy coat. On her lap, she clutched a small wooden chest, a repurposed tea box that held her most private shame, and her only evidence carbon copies of the 12 letters she had written and sent to a silent world. Each one was a monument to a hope that had been methodically dismantled. The coach lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the frozen ruts of the Cheyenne to Rawlins Trail. Outside, the wind scoured the plains, peeling back the thin layer of snow to reveal the gray, dead grass beneath. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, a world stripped down to its bones. Lyle kept up a running commentary on the weather, the sorry state of the horses, and a dubious story about a cousin who had once wrestled a mountain lion. Nora tuned him out, her focus inward, a constant, churning worry for her mother. She had left Maeve in the care of a neighbor, with enough food and firewood for a week, but a week felt like a lifetime. The conflict tore at her. Was she running toward a solution or away from her most sacred duty? 2 other passengers shared the coach. Across from her sat a woman dressed in the simple black habit of a nun. Her face was framed by a white wimple, her features sharp and intelligent, her eyes calm and observant. She introduced herself as Sister Anya, her voice carrying the soft, rounded vowels of Poland. She was traveling to a mission near Rawlins, she explained, carrying a satchel that smelled faintly of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Next to Sister Anya was a man whose presence seemed to fill the small space. He was a powerfully built black man with hands that looked capable of shaping iron, which, as it turned out, was his trade. His name was Jonas Burke, and he spoke with a deep, considered voice that was the perfect counterpoint to Lyle's chatter. He was a blacksmith, heading to a new post with the railroad. He nodded to Nora, his gaze direct and respectful. There was a quiet strength about him that she found reassuring. For hours, the only sounds were the creak of the leather suspension, the rhythmic clopping of the horses, and the ceaseless monologue from the driver's seat. As dusk began to bleed across the gray sky, a new sound joined the chorus, a high, yipping howl that rose and fell with the wind. Coyotes. Nora saw them out of the small, grimy window, loping shadows that kept pace with the coach, their eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. They were a reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization was out here, how quickly the wild could claim you. They stopped for the night at a miserable excuse for a relay station, a sod hut with a leaking roof and a pot of something that might have been stew bubbling over a smoky fire. The food was greasy and the coffee tasted of chicory and despair, but it was warm. They ate in near silence, the weariness of the road settling over them. Lyle, for once, was quiet, too busy shoveling food into his mouth to talk. The journey resumed before dawn, under a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars. The ice on the trail had cracked and refrozen in the night, and the ride was rougher than before. Nora's thoughts were a tangled knot of guilt and determination. She would clutch the wooden box on her lap, the sharp corners digging into her palms, and the anger would rise again. A hot, clean flame that burned away the doubt. She was doing this for her mother, securing a future, exposing a crime. It was all part of the same fight. To turn back now would be to surrender, to admit that a man like Pike could steal their hope and face no consequence. They were in a stretch of rolling, broken country, the flat plains giving way to gullies and low mesas. When it happened, there was no warning. A single rifle shot cracked through the air, and one of the lead horses screamed and went down in a tangle of leather and limbs. The coach skewed violently. Throwing Nora hard against Jonas, Lyle yelled a curse, pulling back on the reins as two riders spurred their horses out from behind a rock formation. They were masked with bandanas, their rifles held steady. "Another coach coming through," Lyle shouted, his voice tight with panic. "It is Deputy Hale. I saw his horse back at the last stop." The highwaymen were not interested in conversation. They wanted the mail sack and the strong box. As Lyle fumbled with the box under his seat, one of the riders grew impatient and fired again. The shot went wide of its intended mark, but a splinter of wood from the coach frame flew through the air and struck Lyle in the arm. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and slumped over. Suddenly, another rider appeared, cresting a nearby hill at a full gallop. It was Deputy Hale, his coat flying behind him, his pistol already drawn. "Get!" he roared, his voice carrying over the wind. The two bandits exchanged a look, judged the odds, and decided their business was concluded. They wheeled their horses and disappeared into the maze of arroyos as quickly as they had appeared. Hale did not give up, spurring his horse in hot pursuit. Inside the coach, there was the smell of gunpowder and the raw, metallic scent of blood. Lyle was conscious, but his face was pale with shock, and a dark stain was spreading rapidly down the sleeve of his coat. "We need to stop the bleeding," Sister Anya said, her voice calm and authoritative. She was already tearing a strip from her petticoat. "Nora, I need your hands." Without a second thought, Nora was at her side. She had helped birth calves and set a lamb's broken leg. She was not squeamish. Her father had taught her to be practical in a crisis. "Panic," he had said, "is a luxury we cannot afford." Jonas helped them move Lyle so he was lying on the floor of the coach. Sister Anya exposed the wound, a nasty gash in the fleshy part of the man's upper arm. It was bleeding freely. "Pressure," Sister Anya commanded. "Here." Nora pressed down with the wad of cloth, her hands firm and steady. She saw the fear in Lyle's eyes and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him he was strong, that it was not so bad, that they would have him patched up in no time. The words came easily, the instincts of a caregiver rising to the surface. She was surprised at her own calmness, the clarity of her thoughts in the midst of the chaos. She was more than a farmer's daughter waiting for a letter. She was a survivor. Sister Anya cleaned the wound with something from her bag that stung fiercely, making Lyle hiss with pain. Then, with Nora maintaining pressure, she stitched the gash closed with a neatness and efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. By the time Deputy Hale returned, his face grim with the news that the robbers had vanished, Lyle's arm was bandaged and the bleeding had stopped. The driver was weak and shaken, but would live. "There is an inn a few miles up the road," Hale said, looking at Nora with a new respect. "We will stop there. Lyle, you are done driving for today." The inn was a 2-story wooden building that leaned to one side as if tired of fighting the wind. The incident had sobered the small group. That night, as Lyle rested, Hale, Jonas, Sister Anya, and Nora sat around a table in the common room. The conversation was subdued, focused on the lawlessness of the territory. "It is men like Bly," Jonas said quietly, swirling the last of his coffee in his cup. "Men who own everything. They make their own law." Nora's head snapped up. "Ephraim Bly?" "You know him?" Jonas asked. "He holds the note on our farm," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jonas exchanged a look with Sister Anya. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower still. "I hear things. Working for the railroad. Men talk. They say Postmaster Pike in Laramie is Bly's man." Nora's heart went cold. "It is true. Then—" "The talk," he continued, "is that Pike watches the mail, especially the matrimonial notices. When a woman writes in, a woman alone with property, he holds her letters. He passes her name and description to Bly. Bly sells the information. To mining camps. To lonely men in his own employ. Men with more coin than character. He makes sure no honest replies get through. So the women grow desperate. He creates the demand, then he sells the supply." The ugly truth of it settled over Nora like a shroud. She thought of her 12 letters, her carefully constructed hopes, laid bare for men to bid on. She felt a wave of nausea. She had not just been ignored. She had been catalogued and priced like livestock. The shame was a bitter acid in her throat. She felt foolish, naive, for believing that a simple letter could be her salvation. "What about you, Nora?" Sister Anya asked gently, her eyes full of a kindness that threatened to undo Nora's composure. "What business takes you to Medicine Bow?" Nora reached into her satchel and pulled out the stolen letter, the one with the purple stamp. She laid it on the table. "This one got through his net, somehow," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and grief. "He tried to hide it, but I found it. It is from a man named Cade Walker. I am going to find him. I am going to find out what he had to say." Jonas picked up the envelope, studying it. Medicine Bow Relay Station. That is a lonely place. Just a few men tending the horses for the stage line. Nora's resolve hardened. All her doubts, all her guilt about leaving her mother, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard certainty. This was bigger than her farm now. It was about every woman whose letter had been intercepted, every hope that had been sold. She could not turn back. The next morning, before the coach was set to leave, she bought a sheet of paper and an envelope from the innkeeper. Her hands were steady as she wrote. The words were not polished or carefully chosen this time. They were raw, torn from the very center of her being. She addressed the letter to Cade Walker, at the relay station in Medicine Bow. She did not make a copy. This letter was not for her box of failures. It was a final, desperate cast into the silence. She wrote, "If you are still alive, please answer just once, if only to let me know I was not dreaming in vain." She sealed the envelope and handed it to Deputy Hale, who was riding along with the coach for another day. "Will you see that this goes into the mail sack?" she asked, the real one. Hale looked from the letter to her determined face. He nodded slowly. "I will, Miss Quinn. You have my word." As the coach pulled away, Nora watched the inn disappear behind them. She had sent her last message. Now, all she could do was ride toward the answer, hoping against hope that this time her words would find their way. The miles ahead were no longer just empty spaces on a map. They were miles of waiting, miles of silence that had to be broken. The all moved in Cade Walker's hand with a life of its own, a steady, rhythmic punching through the thick skirt of a half-finished saddle. His tent, pitched in the desolate grandeur of the Wyoming Badlands, did little to blunt the wind that moaned through the eroded spires of rock. The work was all he had. The familiar motions a balm for a mind that never truly settled. Leather and thread. These were things he could understand. They did what they were supposed to do. They did not make promises they could not keep. A thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a day of dust and screaming cattle. It was a year ago, but the memory was always close. A phantom limb that ached with the changing weather. The stampede, the sight of his younger brother. Rhett, his face a white mask of surprise, going down under a wave of panicked hooves. Cade had been 10 feet away and might as well have been on the moon. The guilt was a physical thing, a weight he carried that was heavier than any saddle. After Rhett, something in him had shut down. He left the ranching life, the constant proximity to the very animals that had taken his brother, and took up the solitary trade his father had taught him. He moved with the seasons, following the work, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. A reply is a promise. He had told himself over and over, and promises can be lost. Silence was safer. Silence was honest. Yet, 6 months ago, he had broken his own rule. He had been in Laramie, finishing a job, when he saw a copy of the Matrimonial Times left behind in the saloon. He never read such things, but a headline had caught his eye. He had read Nora Quinn's words, and they had been different from the others. There was no desperation in them, only a clear, honest statement of who she was and what she wanted. A partner, a life. He had read the letter 3 times, the neat script speaking of a quiet strength that resonated with a part of him he thought had died with Rhett. He had spent 2 days composing a reply. He wrote of his trade, of his brother, of his own weariness with a life lived on the move. He was not a man of fancy words, but he tried to be honest. He told her he would be in the Laramie area for another month and would be honored to call on her. He had folded the letter, his hands clumsy with an unfamiliar hope, and taken it to the post office. The postmaster, a small man with shifty eyes, had taken the letter and his coin, assuring him it would go out on the next day's stage. A month passed, filled with a nervous anticipation Cade had not felt in years. He found himself thinking of her, wondering about the color of her eyes, the sound of her voice. Then, one afternoon, the postmaster handed him a letter. It was his own. Stamped across the front were 2 purple words that had slammed a door in his soul. Return to sender. The shame had been immediate and hot. She had changed her mind, or perhaps his letter had been too plain, his confession of loss too much for a stranger to bear. The rejection confirmed his deepest fear. To reach out was to risk being cut off. He packed his tools that same day, leaving Laramie in the foolish hope he had allowed himself to feel. He had returned to the silence, to the Badlands, to the uncomplicated company of leather and steel. Now, a new letter had found him, carried by a lone rider making his way to a mining camp. The rider had grumbled about the detour, but a letter was a sacred trust in this empty country. Cade had taken it, his heart giving a painful lurch at the sight of the Laramie postmark. He had almost thrown it on the fire unopened, but he recognized the handwriting. He opened it as a cold, spitting rain began to fall, the drops hissing against the canvas of his tent. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly blurred. The words were few, but they hit him with the force of a physical blow. If you are still alive, please answer just once, if only to let me know I was not dreaming in vain. He read it again and again, the rain turning to sleet, the temperature dropping. It was not the letter of a woman who had rejected him. It was the letter of a woman who had never heard from him at all. The silence had not been his choice. Not this time. And it had not been hers. It had been stolen from them both. The postmaster, the shifty eyes, the too quick assurance. He had been lied to. His promise had been intercepted. His hope deliberately throttled. And she, this strong, honest woman, had been left to think he was just another man who could not be bothered to reply. The knowledge was a hot poker in his gut. Her letters went unanswered. The thought became a drumbeat in his head. The injustice of it was a poison. All his carefully constructed walls of silence, of self-preservation, crumbled in an instant. The fear of loss was still there, a cold stone in his stomach. But something else rose to meet it. A fierce, protective anger. A sense of a wrong that had to be righted. He moved with a sudden, explosive energy. In minutes, he had packed his bedroll, his tools, and the few provisions he had. He saddled his horse, a tough, reliable roan. His movements economical and precise. 100 miles of rough country, with a winter storm brewing in the north. It did not matter. An answer had been requested. An answer would be delivered. He rode through the night, the sleet turning to a hard, driving snow. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear him from the saddle. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the land and the faint light of a shrouded moon. The cold gnawed at him, but the fire in his belly burned hotter. As he rode, the past rode with him. He saw Rhett's grin, saw him on his favorite buckskin, saw the easy confidence the boy had carried. He heard his laughter, and then came the other memory, the bellowing of 1,000 terrified steers, the ground shaking, a cloud of choking dust. He saw Rhett's horse stumble, saw his brother's eyes, wide with shock, find his for just a second of helplessness that had stretched into a lifetime of regret. He had frozen then, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming horror of it. He pushed the memory away, focusing on the here and now, the feel of the reins in his frozen hands, the steady rhythm of his horse's gait. He would not freeze again. Near dawn, he stopped in a sheltered draw to rest his horse, the roan, exhausted, stepped on a patch of ground covered by a light dusting of snow and let out a piercing scream of pain. Its leg was caught. Cade slid from the saddle, his pistol drawn, his heart pounding. It was a bear trap. The iron jaws clamped tight around the horse's cannon bone. The steel teeth had not broken the skin, but the pressure was immense, and the horse was beginning to panic, pulling against the chain that held the trap to a buried log. The animal's terror was a mirror of the stampede. The wild eyes, the trembling muscles, the old paralysis threatened to claim him. But this was different. This was a problem he could solve. He holstered his pistol and spoke to the horse, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Easy now. Easy, boy. I have you." He took his saddle slicker and gently covered the horse's head, calming it. Then, with a cold, methodical focus, he examined the trap. It was an old design, strong and cruel. He needed leverage. Using his saddle axe, he cut a thick branch from a dead cottonwood. He worked it between the jaws of the trap, his muscles straining against the immense pressure of the spring. For a moment, nothing happened. The iron held. He reset his position, took a deep breath, and threw his entire weight against the lever. There was a groan of protesting metal, and the jaws opened. Just an inch. It was enough. The horse, sensing the release, pulled its leg free. Cade removed the slicker and ran his hands over the horse's leg. It was bruised and swollen, but not broken. He had saved him. The feeling was a revelation. He had not been helpless. He had acted. He had faced the crisis and won. He stood there in the pre-dawn gloom, the snow swirling around him, and felt a subtle shift inside, a small, hard knot of guilt beginning to loosen. He rode on, the storm closing in, the world dissolving into a maelstrom of white. It was late the next night when he finally reached the Laramie Plains. The snow was falling as ash now, thick and silent. He found the Quinn farm, a dark shape against the snow, a single, weak light flickering in one window. The place was unnervingly quiet. The windmill was frozen, its blade still. No smoke rose from the chimney. A sense of dread, cold and heavy, settled over him. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and pushed open the door of the small sod house. The room was freezing, the fire in the hearth long dead. In a small bed in the corner, a woman lay shivering under a pile of thin blankets. She was old and frail, her breath coming in shallow rasps. It had to be Nora's mother. He knelt by the bed, pulling a flask of whiskey from his coat. He coaxed a few drops between her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with fever. "Miss Quinn?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. "Nora, where is she?" The woman, Maeve, focused on him for a moment, a flicker of recognition in her gaze, or perhaps just a lucid moment in the fever's grip. Her voice was a dry whisper, a bare thread of sound in the frozen silence of the house. "The girl," she breathed, her words fragile as ice. "She went to town to find justice." The journey back to Laramie was a fight against the storm's own will. The stagecoach had turned back, its driver unwilling to risk the worsening blizzard, leaving Nora, Jonas, and Sister Anya at the last inn. But Nora could not wait. The knowledge of her mother, alone and sick, was a spur in her heart. Against all advice, she had paid a homesteader a ludicrous sum to take her the last 20 miles in his sturdy wagon. Jonas, his face set with a quiet concern that needed no words, had insisted on coming with her. She left Jonas to find a doctor for her mother, promising to meet him after she had settled one final piece of business. The wind in Laramie's main street was a physical entity, a solid wall of ice and fury that stole the breath and scoured the skin. Nora leaned into it, her blue scarf a frozen banner across her face, and pushed her way toward the feeble light of the post office. The bell above the door jangled violently as she entered, followed by a blast of wind and snow that sent paper skittering across the floor. Postmaster Pike looked up from his stool, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance that quickly curdled into something else when he saw her face. It was not the face of the hopeful, deferential girl who had come asking for mail. This was the face of a woman who had come for an accounting. "I am here for my letters, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying easily over the howl of the wind. Pike's damp mustache twitched. "I told you, Miss Quinn, the mail is stopped. Nothing has come through." He began to shuffle a stack of waybills, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "I am not talking about the mail that is coming. I am talking about the mail that is already here, the mail you have been holding." He gave a short, nervous laugh. "That is a serious accusation, a federal offense, to tamper with the mail. You have been out in the storm too long, I think." Nora walked to the counter, her movements deliberate. She placed her cold hands flat on the wood. She saw it then, a thick bundle of envelopes bound with twine, sitting on a low shelf beneath the counter, partially obscured by a sack of grain. On the top envelope, she could clearly see her own name. "You are a thief," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than a shout. "You steal hope from women and sell it to the highest bidder. You work for Ephraim Bly." Pike's face went pale. He stood up, knocking his stool over with a clatter. "You are hysterical. Get out of my establishment before I call the deputy. Give me my letters." As he reached for the bundle, perhaps to hide it more thoroughly, the front door of the post office flew open with a deafening crash. It was not pushed by a human hand, but torn from its latch by a gust of wind so violent it seemed the storm itself had decided to enter the argument. The single kerosene lamp hanging from the ceiling flickered wildly for a second, its flame dancing like a frantic moth, and then it was extinguished. The room was plunged into a shocking, absolute darkness. The only light a swirling, chaotic gray from the open doorway. A figure stood there, a silhouette against the blizzard's white rage. It was a man, broad-shouldered and tall, his form made monstrous by a heavy, ice-encrusted coat. Snow covered him like a second skin, and the wind whipped his long duster around him. He took one step into the room, and the door slammed shut behind him, plunging them back into near blackness, the only light now coming from the grimy front windows. Nora stood frozen, her heart leaping into her throat. Pike made a small, frightened sound. The figure stamped his boots, dislodging clumps of snow and ice that cracked on the floorboards. He pushed back his snow-laden hat, and in the faint, ghostly light, Nora could see a pair of steady gray eyes, a strong jaw, and a thin white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, hoarse rasp, roughened by 100 miles of wind and cold. "Her letters went unanswered," he said, his gaze finding Nora in the gloom, "until the mail-order cowboy rode 100 miles just to find her." The words hung in the frigid air, a statement of fact so unbelievable, so profoundly impossible, that for a moment Nora could not breathe. This was him. This was the man from the letter. Cade Walker. He was not a name on a page. He was real. He took another step forward. "I am late," he said, his voice softer now. "But I am here." The spell was broken. 1,000 questions, 1,000 emotions, swirled inside her. But what came out was a breathless, almost giddy response, a shield of wit against the overwhelming reality of the moment. "Next time," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "you only need to reply." A ghost of a smile touched Cade's lips. "I missed a big promise," he said, "so now I can only do big things." Their strange, suspended moment was shattered by Pike. He saw his authority dissolving, the situation spiraling out of his control. "Who in blazes are you?" he demanded, his voice shrill, "barging in here?" "I am the man whose letter you stole," Cade answered, and all the warmth was gone from his voice. It was as cold and hard as the iron outside. He moved to the end of the counter, blocking Pike's only escape. "Now, you are going to give the lady her mail, all of it." With Cade flanking him and Nora in front of him, Pike was trapped. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered rat. He saw there was no way out. With a trembling, resentful hand, he reached under the counter and pulled out the bundle of letters tied with twine. He threw it on the counter. "There," he spat. "Take it and go." Nora's hands untied the string. There were at least 20 letters, all addressed to her, from all over the territory. But as the bundle came apart, another, larger stack that had been hidden behind it was revealed. Dozens more letters, addressed to other women: Mary Beth Parker, Anna Schmidt, Sarah Gibbs, women she knew, women who were widows, or unmarried, or simply alone, trying to find a life in this hard country. A cold, sickening fury washed over her. "This is not just about me," she said, looking at Cade. The bell on the door jangled again, and Deputy Hale stepped inside, bringing another swirl of snow with him. He took in the scene with a quick, practiced eye, Pike pale and sweating, Nora with a look of cold fury, and the big, formidable stranger covered in ice. "What is going on here?" "Pike," Hale asked, his tone weary. "She is accusing me of withholding mail," Pike whined, seeing his chance. "And this man, he threatened me. It is federal law. Hale, you have to arrest them." Hale looked at Nora, then at the pile of letters on the counter. His face was a mask of conflict. He knew what Pike was. He knew who he worked for, but Ephraim Bly's reach was long. Challenging him was challenging the very structure of power in the county. "Now, Nora, let us not be hasty," Hale began, his voice placating. "There is probably a simple explanation for all this." "There is," Nora said, her voice ringing with conviction.
It is called theft and conspiracy. Are you going to do your job, deputy? Or do you work for Bly, too? Before Hale could answer, Pike made his move. With a desperate cry, he lunged for the scattered letters, grabbing a handful. He scrambled toward the counter where a ledger book lay open, the same book Jonas had spoken of. Next to it was a can of kerosene for the lamp. In one fluid, panicked motion. He unscrewed the cap of the can and doused the letters in the open ledger. He fumbled in his pocket for a match. "This is all a lie!" he shrieked. "There is no proof." Cade moved faster than Nora would have thought possible. He vaulted over the counter, his big frame moving with a surprising grace. He caught Pike's wrist just as the man struck the match. The small flame flared, illuminating Pike's terrified face. At the same moment, the door opened again. It was Jonas Burke, his expression grim. He had obviously heard the commotion from the street. Jonas did not hesitate. He moved to Cade's side, his big blacksmith's hands easily overpowering Pike's other arm. Nora grabbed the sodden ledger, pulling it away from the danger. The match fell to the floor, where Cade stomped it out with his boot. The brief, violent struggle was over in seconds. Pike was breathing in ragged, sobbing gasps, pinned between Cade and Jonas. "Well, well," a calm, cold voice said from the doorway. "What a fascinating little scene." Ephraim Bly stood there, flanked by two of his ranch hands. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man, his fine wool coat untouched by the storm. He looked at the scene not with anger, but with a kind of detached amusement, like a man watching a play he had already read. "It appears," Bly said, his eyes settling on Nora, "that this young woman has taken it upon herself to interfere with the operations of the United States Postal Service, a very serious federal crime. Deputy," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable command, "I believe you have a duty to perform. Arrest her." Deputy Hale's face was a study in misery. He was a man caught between a hard rock and a harder man. Ephraim Bly's command hung in the air, as cold and heavy as the iron stove in the corner. Arresting Nora Quinn felt wrong. Hale knew it in his bones. But defying Bly in his own town, with his men standing right there, felt like professional suicide. "It is a federal matter, Ephraim," Hale said, his voice struggling for an authority it did not possess. "I cannot just—" "Of course not," Bly said smoothly, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Everything must be done with propriety. Let us not have a trial here in the street. Let us have a public inquiry. The town has a right to hear the accusations and the defense. We will use the freight company's meeting tent. It is large enough, and it will get us all out of this storm." It was not a suggestion. It was an order, wrapped in the language of civic duty. Bly's men were already moving, spreading the word. Within the hour, a grim procession made its way through the blizzard to a large canvas tent, normally used for storing goods, that had been erected behind the saloon. Inside, lanterns cast a sickly yellow light, their flames guttering in the drafts that snaked under the canvas walls. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful chorus, and the tent's poles groaned under the strain. A makeshift courtroom had been arranged. Bly sat behind a long trestle table, positioning himself as the arbiter of this farce. Pike, looking small and vindicated, sat beside him. Deputy Hale stood uneasily near the entrance, his face a grim mask. The tent was half full of townsfolk, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and sullen resentment. Most were Bly's employees or men who owed him money. Nora stood in the center, her back straight, her chin high. Cade was a stone wall at her side, his presence a silent declaration that she was not alone. Jonas Burke stood with them, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression unreadable but resolute. A moment later, Sister Anya entered. Her habit dark against the snow, she brushed from her shoulders. She carried a small, leather-bound ledger and sat quietly on a crate near the front. "Let us begin," Bly announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. We are here because this woman, Nora Quinn, has made a grave accusation against a federal employee. Postmaster Pike, she has, without evidence, accused him of corruption and has caused a public disturbance. He turned his cold eyes on Nora. What say you to this? I say that Postmaster Pike is a thief, Nora said, her voice clear and strong. He stole my letters and the letters of many other women. He did so on your orders. A murmur went through the crowd. Bly held up a hand for silence. You see hysteria. She offers no proof, only wild claims. And who is this man? He asked, gesturing to Cade with a dismissive wave. Some drifter she has enlisted in her fantasy. Another fortune hunter, no doubt, come to answer her desperate advertisements. Cade stepped forward. The scar over his eyes seemed to darken in the lantern light. My name is Cade Walker. I am here because my letter to Miss Quinn, sent 6 months ago, was returned to me by this man, he said, pointing a finger at Pike. A lie, because she never saw it. I am here because her last letter found me, and it was the letter of a woman who had been wronged. So you admit you came here because of a matrimonial notice? Bly sneered. You came to purchase a wife. Sight unseen. Cade's jaw tightened. I did not come to purchase anything. I came because I read her words, and they were honest. In a world full of noise, they were quiet and true. I came to give her the answer her honesty deserved. His speech was plain, unpolished, and for that reason, it carried the unmistakable ring of truth. It silenced the murmurs. It was a language of the heart, clumsy and profound, that everyone in that tent, from the most hardened ranch hand to the most fearful shopkeeper, could understand. Jonas Burke spoke next, his deep voice a calming anchor in the tense atmosphere. I have heard the stories, he said, from men who work the rail lines and the mines. Stories about women who write for husbands and never get a reply. Stories about a postmaster in Laramie who sells the names of lonely women to outfits that need them. Lies and rumors, Pike squeaked from his chair. Sister Anya stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her quiet dignity commanded the attention of the entire tent. I am a nun, she said simply. My work is to offer comfort. I often sit with the sick and with the dying. Over the years, I have kept a record of their final words, their last confessions. She opened her small ledger. I have entries for 3 women who died of fever in a mining camp west of here. All 3 came to Wyoming in response to letters from men they never met. All 3 told me, in their last hours, of writing to matrimonial papers, of a long silence, and then of a sudden offer from a foreman who seemed to know all about them, an offer they felt they could not refuse. She closed the book. The silence in the tent was absolute, broken only by the screaming of the wind. Bly's composure finally cracked. He slammed his hand on the table. This is a circus, a collection of hearsay and deathbed ramblings. It proves nothing. We have the law on our side, the clear fact of a federal employee being slandered in his place of business. Just as Deputy Hale took a reluctant step forward, the tent flap was thrown open. A figure stood there. So caked in snow it looked like an apparition. It swayed for a moment, then stumbled inside. It was Maeve Quinn. Nora cried out and ran to her mother's side. Maeve was burning with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She had walked, somehow, through the heart of the blizzard, driven by a force stronger than any storm. "Mama, what are you doing?" Nora sobbed, holding her mother's frail body. Maeve clutched at the front of Nora's coat, her fingers like bird claws. She pushed a folded packet of papers into Nora's hand. He faked the debt," Maeve whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "The papers, they are false. He made them up, to own the farm, to own you." She could say no more. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed, a dead weight in her daughter's arms. At that exact moment, the storm, which had been testing the limits of the tent, delivered its final, furious blow. There was a sound like a rifle shot as the main ridgepole, burdened with a heavy load of snow and assaulted by a tremendous gust of wind, snapped in two. The world dissolved into a chaos of canvas, snow, and screaming. The lanterns were extinguished, plunging the scene into a terrifying, wind-swept darkness. The heavy canvas roof collapsed, burying tables and people alike. Nora, shielding her mother's body with her own, was knocked to the ground. Cade and Jonas bellowed for people to stay calm, their voices barely audible over the roar of the blizzard. Bly's carefully constructed stage had been demolished by a power far greater than his own. The papers on his table, the fraudulent debt notes Nora now held, and whatever false evidence he had been prepared to present, were scattered and lost, swept away into the raging white torrent that had once been the town's main street. In the confusion, a section of the collapsed tent, heavy with a thick layer of wet snow, pinned Deputy Hale to the ground, trapping his legs. He struggled, but the weight was too much. He saw a broken pole begin to slide toward him and closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Suddenly, the weight was lessened. He opened his eyes to see Nora Quinn, her face grim with determination, straining against a piece of the broken frame, using it as a lever. It was not enough, but her effort gave Cade and Jonas the moment they needed. They lunged forward, and with a combined heave, they lifted the wreckage, and Nora pulled the deputy free. Hale staggered to his feet, breathing heavily. He looked at the woman who, moments before, he had been about to arrest. She had not run. She had not thought of herself. She had saved him. In that instant, something shifted within him. The carefully balanced scales of his personal and professional life tipped decisively. He saw Bly scrambling in the snow, desperately trying to gather his lost papers, his dignity forgotten. And he saw Nora, helping Sister Anya make Maeve comfortable, her face a mask of worry and love. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, which side the law should be on. The sham trial was over, its verdict rendered by the storm. People scrambled for the shelter of the saloon and the hotel, their brief taste of mob justice forgotten in the face of a real and immediate danger. Later that night, the storm had lessened to a steady, heavy snowfall. Cade had found a sheltered corner in the livery stable, where he was tending to his horse. A figure emerged from the swirling snow. It was Deputy Hale. He did not say a word, just walked up to Cade and stood there for a moment, the silence thick with unspoken meaning. Then, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He pressed it into Cade's hand. "Be at the post office at dawn," Hale said, his voice low and firm. "This will give you the right to go through the front door." Cade looked down. It was a warrant to search the United States Post Office for stolen mail, a small, fragile seed of true justice, planted in the heart of a frozen, lawless night. Dawn broke over a world scoured clean. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape of profound silence and sculpted snow. In the cold, blue light, Laramie looked like a town holding its breath. Cade, Nora, and Deputy Hale met in front of the post office, their own breath pluming in the frigid air. The warrant in Hale's hand was a small, powerful rectangle of paper, an emblem of his changed allegiance. Postmaster Pike opened the door to their knock, his face a ruin of fear and bluster. When he saw the warrant, the color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, unhealthy gray. He stepped aside without a word. The inside of the post office was cold and disordered, a testament to the previous night's chaos. Hale began a methodical search of the main room, while Cade's quiet, observant eyes scanned the floor. It was Cade who noticed a set of scuff marks near a large shipping crate, marks that broke the otherwise even layer of dust. He moved the crate. Beneath it lay a trap door, its ring pull set flush with the floorboards. The cellar was small and damp, smelling of mildew and the slow decay of paper. By the light of Hale's lantern, they saw the hoard. Sacks and boxes overflowed with letters, hundreds of them, a vast, silent testament to stolen hope. And on a small, makeshift desk sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, the Black Book. Nora opened it, her hand steady despite the cold. The neat columns and Pike's spidery script detailed a monstrous enterprise. Names of women, their ages, a brief, cold description: hard worker, plain, comely, reads, good childbearing hips. And next to each entry, a price, a few dollars for a name, more for a detailed summary of a woman's letter. Her own name was there, followed by a dozen entries. As they stood in the grim silence of the cellar, Sister Anya arrived. Having seen the lights and the deputy's horse, she came down the narrow steps, her face etched with concern. Hale showed her the ledger. She scanned the pages, her expression growing ever more pained. Then she moved toward a sack of letters in the corner, one that was bound with a different kind of twine. Her breath caught in her throat. Tied to the twine was a small, crudely carved wooden cross. I know this mark, she whispered, her fingers tracing the cross. A young woman from my home country, Anna Kowalski. She came here 2 years ago. She was a fine seamstress, but she was alone. She wrote to me that she was going to use a matrimonial agency to find a good husband. She was so full of hope. Then her letters stopped. I was told she had moved to a mining camp and had died of a fever a few months later. Sister Anya's eyes met Nora's, and in that shared gaze was a terrible understanding. The women who disappeared had not just been unlucky. They had been sold into desperate situations, their lines of communication deliberately severed, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. This was not just theft. It was human trafficking, orchestrated by Bly and facilitated by this pathetic little man who was now weeping in the corner of his own establishment. They found more evidence in the cellar. Shipping manifests for a private freight line owned by one of Bly's shell companies, instructions for bundling letters and sending them not through the federal mail, but by private courier to Bly's main ranch, from where he distributed his illicit information. He had built his own system of communication, a shadow post office that operated beyond the reach of the law. When they emerged from the cellar, word had spread. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered outside, their faces a mixture of shock and a kind of sullen defensiveness. A woman's voice, sharp and unsympathetic, cut through the morning air. Well, what do you expect putting themselves out there like that? For any man to read, they were asking for trouble. Nora stopped on the top step of the post office, the ledger clutched in her hand. She turned to face the crowd, to face the woman who had spoken. Her anger was a cold, clarifying fire. Asking for what? She demanded, her voice ringing out in the still air. To not be lonely, to find a partner to build a life with, seeking happiness, is not a crime. She held up the ledger. Stealing letters is a crime. Selling women's names like they are cattle is a crime. And staying silent when you know a wrong is being done, that is a crime, too. She looked at the faces before her, at the men who looked away, at the women whose expressions were a mixture of fear and a dawning, reluctant empathy. She had spoken not just for herself, but for Anna Kowalski, and for every woman whose name was in that book. Later that afternoon, after giving their statements to Hale and ensuring Maeve was stable under Sister Anya's care, Nora felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The town felt small and suffocating, its whispers following her everywhere. She found the small wooden tea box in the back of the homesteader's wagon, the one that held the copies of her letters. For a moment, she thought of burning it, but that felt like erasing a part of herself. Instead, she took out a fresh sheet of paper. She sat in the quiet of the livery stable, the air smelling of hay and horses, and began to write. It was the shortest letter of all. She folded it, but instead of putting it in an envelope, she placed it directly into the scratched wooden box. She closed the lid. On the outside, she wrote 2 words, "For myself." She had spent months writing to a phantom, an unknown future. Now, she was addressing her own resilience, her own strength. The answer she had been seeking was not in a man, but in the woman she had become. As evening fell, the cold deepened. Cade found her by the stable, staring out at the plains as the last light bled from the sky. The day's events had left them both raw, the adrenaline giving way to a shared, quiet ache. "There is an old way station a mile down the road," he said, his voice low. "It will be empty. We can get out of this town for a few hours. Get a fire going." She nodded, too tired to speak. They walked in silence, the snow crunching under their boots. The way station was a simple log structure, abandoned for the winter, but its 4 walls and a solid roof felt like a sanctuary. Cade, with his quiet competence, soon had a small fire crackling in the stone hearth. The warmth was a blessing, slowly unknotting the tension in Nora's shoulders. They sat on a dusty wooden bench, sharing a thick oilskin blanket Cade had brought from his saddle roll. They did not talk about Bly, or the letters, or the future. They listened to the fire and the wind. The small space was filled with a sense of peace that Nora had not felt in a very long time. It was the peace of a battle fought, if not yet won. In the flickering firelight, she looked at him, at the strong, quiet man who had ridden 100 miles on the strength of a few honest words. He was looking at the fire, but she felt he was aware of her gaze. His hand lay on the bench between them, tentatively. She reached out and touched his fingers. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over and gently enclosed hers. His grip was warm and firm, a silent comfort that spoke more than words ever could. The touch was a current that ran between them, a recognition of all they had endured, separately and together. He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious in the firelight. He raised his other hand and gently touched the side of her face, his thumb brushing away a stray strand of hair. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that it made her breath catch. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender to the moment, to the fragile, powerful connection that had grown between them in the heart of the storm. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. His kiss was not the kiss of a conqueror or a buyer, but of an equal. It was hesitant at first, a question. It was chapped and tasted of the cold, and of the coffee he had drunk earlier. It was trembling and real, and it was the first kiss of her life. It was a promise, not of a future free of hardship, but of a future that would not be faced alone. When they broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the cold air. A fragile hope, more powerful than any she had tried to mail, began to bloom in Nora's heart. But miles away, in the warmth of his ranch house, Ephraim Bly was not thinking of hope. He was thinking of revenge. He paced before his own roaring fire, his face a mask of cold fury. The girl had made him look like a fool. She had turned his own town against him. "He will not get away with this," he snarled to the 2 grim-faced men who stood before him. "I want her. There is a $500 reward for the man who brings me Nora Quinn, for slander and incitement, and I want the saddlemaker too. They are headed for Cheyenne to report this to the United States Marshal. I have no doubt. Make sure they do not get there. Dry Creek. The bridge is narrow there, and the canyon is deep. Set your trap. I do not want them brought to justice. I want them erased." The trail to Cheyenne was a thread of hope stitched across a landscape that was slowly coming back to life. The great snow was melting under a sun that held a new, though distant, promise of warmth. The plains, soft and sodden, gave way to a more rugged country of rolling hills and rocky outcrops. Water trickled and then rushed in every gully, the land shedding its winter skin. Cade led the small party, his roan horse sure-footed and steady. Behind him, Nora rode a gentle mare Deputy Hale had procured for her. She carried the heavy ledger in a leather satchel, a weight that was both a burden and a shield. Jonas Burke and Sister Anya rode in a buckboard wagon, their presence a quiet, formidable statement of support. Deputy Hale rode alongside them, his face grim but resolute. He had cast his lot, and there was no turning back.
They were a strange and unlikely caravan of justice, bound for the authority of the United States Marshal. Every rider who appeared on the horizon was a potential threat, every distant sound a possible ambush. But for 2 days, they traveled without incident. A fragile optimism began to grow among them. In the evenings, around a small, carefully guarded fire, they would talk. Nora spoke of her mother's resilience, her quiet hope now rekindled by Sister Anya's constant care back in Laramie. Cade, in his quiet way, spoke of the craft of saddle-making, the integrity of a good piece of leather. He and Nora rarely spoke of what had passed between them in the abandoned way station. But it was there, a silent, powerful current that flowed beneath every shared glance, every small, considerate gesture. "We are making good time," Hale said on the morning of the 3rd day. "Dry Creek Canyon is just ahead. Once we are through it, the land opens up all the way to Cheyenne. It is the last real danger spot." The canyon was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, carved by millennia of spring floods. A narrow plank bridge, suspended by thick ropes, spanned the chasm. Below, the creek was not the gentle stream of its name, but a roaring, brown torrent, choked with melting ice and debris. The sound of the water was a deep, angry growl. Cade reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the rocky cliffs on the far side. "Something feels wrong," he said, his voice low. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the first rifle shot echoed through the canyon, the sound flattened by the roar of the water. A splinter of wood exploded from the bridge's railing, inches from Nora's hand, from the rocks on the other side. 3 riders emerged, their rifles raised. At the same moment, 2 more appeared behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. It was Bly's men. "Get the ledger," one of the men yelled, his voice thin against the noise of the flood. The firefight was instant and chaotic. Hale and Cade returned fire, using their horses and the wagon for cover. Jonas, armed with a heavy shotgun, laid down a field of fire that made the ambushers hesitate, but they were outnumbered. A bullet struck one of the main suspension ropes of the bridge. The thick hemp frayed, and then, with a sound like a great tearing cloth, it snapped. The bridge shuddered violently. Dropping several feet on one side, Nora's mare screamed and reared in panic. Nora lost her grip on the reins and was thrown from the saddle. She landed hard on the tilting planks, the satchel with the ledger flying from her grasp. She scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the leather strap just as a second rope gave way. With a final, terrible groan of splintering wood, the bridge tore free from the canyon wall and collapsed into the torrent below, taking Nora with it. For Cade Walker, the world stopped. The crack of rifles, the shouts of men, the roar of the water. It all faded into a single, overwhelming hum. He saw Nora disappear into the churning, icy chaos, and the last 10 years of his life ceased to exist. He was back in the dust and the terror, the ground shaking, the air thick with the smell of fear. He saw a boy's face, white with shock. His brother's face, going down under a wave of hooves. He saw Rhett. His hands, locked on the reins of his horse, were useless claws of ice. His breath was a stone in his chest. His muscles refused to obey, freeze, the same cold, paralyzing helplessness that had held him then, held him now. He was 10 feet from a nightmare, and he could not move. Rhett's eyes, full of a terrible, final surprise, stared at him from the depths of the floodwater. Nora. A small, desperate cry cut through the fog of his memory. He saw a flash of blue in the water, her scarf, the one her mother had made. And then he saw her head break the surface, her dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with terror, not for herself, but for him. She was looking right at him. He was not seeing a ghost. He was seeing a living, breathing woman who was about to die. The choice was a physical thing, a great wrenching heave in his soul. He could stay here, in the frozen past with his guilt and his brother, or he could move. He could act, he could choose the present.
He chose Nora. With a raw cry that was torn from the deepest part of him, he spurred his horse toward the edge of the canyon. The roan, sensing the desperate urgency, leaped without hesitation. They plunged into the icy water in a great explosion of spray. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, but it was clarifying. It burned away the last of the ghosts. He lost the horse in the current, but he did not care. He was a strong swimmer, and his focus was narrowed to a single point, the small figure being swept downstream toward a rapids where the water crashed against a jumble of sharp, black rocks. Above, on the canyon rim, the battle raged. Ephraim Bly himself had ridden into view, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He saw Nora in the water, saw Cade swimming desperately after her. This was his chance to end it all. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the helpless figure in the water. "No!" Deputy Hale yelled. He saw Bly's intent. In that moment, all the years of compromise, of looking the other way, fell away. He raised his own rifle, not as a lawman serving a warrant, but as a man protecting an innocent life. He fired. The shot was true. Bly cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. He stared at Hale, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. Postmaster Pike, who had been forced to ride with the ambushers, saw his protector fall. He saw the tide of violence turn. All the fight went out of him. He threw down his weapon and began to babble, a torrent of confession and fear. He told them everything, about the ledger, the private couriers, the women who had disappeared, his voice a high, thin wail against the canyon's roar. In the water, Cade reached Nora. She was weak, her limbs numb with cold, but she was still fighting. He grabbed her, pulling her into the relative calm of the water behind a large boulder. She was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. The current had torn the blue scarf from her neck. He saw it, a flash of defiant color, snagged on a piece of the broken bridge a few feet away. He had to get her to shore, but he could not leave it. It was more than a piece of wool. It was a promise. It was hope. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice rough. He pushed off from the rock, fighting the current for a few desperate strokes. He grabbed the scarf, its wet wool a tangible link to her, to life. He struggled back to the boulder and, with fumbling, frozen fingers, he tied the scarf gently around her neck. Her skin was as cold as ice. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the ghosts that had been chased from his. "This is a promise," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I will not lose you again." With a final, desperate effort, he pushed them away from the rock and toward the shallows of the canyon bank. He dragged her from the water, and they collapsed on the muddy ground, exhausted, freezing but alive. The sound of hoofbeats, many of them, thundered from the trail. A group of riders appeared, hard-faced men with stars pinned to their vests, the United States Marshal and his deputies. Alerted by a telegram Hale had sent before they left Laramie, they had ridden out to meet them and had been drawn by the sound of the gunfire. The rest of Bly's men surrendered without a fight. The Marshal's men took the wounded Bly and the weeping Pike into custody. They listened to Hale's grim report, took possession of the sodden ledger that Jonas had managed to retrieve from the wreckage, and looked at the two shivering figures on the riverbank with a quiet respect. Justice had come to Dry Creek Canyon. It had been delivered not just by the law, but by a cowboy who had conquered his past, a lawman who had reclaimed his soul, and a woman who had refused to let her letters go unanswered. The wheels of federal justice, once set in motion, ground forward with an inexorable force. Postmaster Pike, his courage and his loyalty to Bly washed away in the icy waters of Dry Creek, sang a song of confession that dismantled an empire of greed. He detailed the entire network, naming every man, every private courier, every foreman at every remote mining camp who had ever paid for the name of a lonely woman. Ephraim Bly, stripped of his land and his influence, was taken to Cheyenne to await a federal trial he could not escape. The charge was not slander, but a far more serious and intricate web of mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The United States Marshal's Office, with a grim efficiency, undertook the task of righting the great wrong. Sacks of stolen mail were sorted and dispatched, all across the Wyoming Territory. Letters, some months or even years old, found their way to their intended recipients. For some, it was a moment of joyous reunion, a connection thought lost, now miraculously restored. For others, it was a bittersweet closure, a final word from a sender who had long since moved on or passed away. But for all, it was an answer. The great crushing silence that had blanketed so many lives was finally broken. Back at the small farm on the Laramie Plains, a quieter, more personal form of justice was taking place, under the tireless, gentle care of Sister Anya and Nora. Maeve Quinn began to heal. There was no miracle, no sudden recovery. It was a slow, painstaking process, built on warm broth, clean linens, and the powerful medicine of her daughter's presence. The fever receded, and the terrible, bloody cough lessened, replaced by a strength that grew, day by day, in her weary lungs. The color returned to her cheeks, a faint but steady bloom of life. She began to sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the prairie turn from the pale, washed-out colors of winter to the tentative greens of spring. The wedding was on a warm afternoon in late May, when the wildflowers were carpeting the plains in splashes of yellow and purple. There was no church, no crowd. They stood on the porch of the sod house, the same porch where Nora had so often stood, staring at an empty horizon. Jonas Burke, his blacksmith's work delayed for a day, stood as their witness, his broad, kind face beaming. Deputy Hale was there too, his presence a quiet testament to his own redemption. Sister Anya held Maeve's hand, both women watching with tears in their eyes. Nora wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, and in her hair, she had tucked a single wild primrose. Cade wore a clean shirt and stood before her, his customary seriousness softened by an emotion that made his gray eyes shine. He did not have a ring. Instead, he held a small wooden box in his large, capable hands. It was Nora's old tea chest, the one that had held her shame and her hope. But it was transformed. He had sanded away the scratches and the stains, and the wood glowed with a new, soft luster. And on the lid, carved in elegant, flowing letters, were the words that had become their story. Her letters went unanswered until the mail-order cowboy rode 100 miles just to find her. He placed the box in her hands. "From now on," he said, his voice low and firm, "every reply will find its person." They spoke their vows in plain, simple words that carried more weight than the most elaborate poetry. The promises they made were not of an easy life, but of a shared one, a life of honesty, of partnership, of facing whatever storms the world might send, together. That evening, the small group shared a simple meal of roasted corn and fresh bread. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall grass, and, in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely, beautiful song to the rising moon. It was not a sound of menace anymore, but a part of the vast, peaceful symphony of the prairie. Later, after their guests had departed and Maeve was sleeping soundly, Nora sat at the small kitchen table, by the light of a single lamp. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She opened her refurbished letterbox, the smooth, sanded wood a comfort beneath her fingers. She began to write, but this letter was not addressed to a stranger or to herself. She dipped the pen in the ink, and at the top of the page, she wrote a single phrase, "To the future." She wrote of a winter that had seemed endless, and of a spring that had finally come. She wrote of justice, not as a grand, abstract idea, but as a small, stubborn seed that could grow in the most unforgiving soil. She wrote of kindness, of the courage of strangers who became friends. And she wrote of a love that was not found in a letter, but was forged in a storm. A love that was quiet and steady,
and as real as the solid earth beneath their feet. That night was as simple and as profound as their wedding vows. There were no grand pronouncements, only the quiet comfort of a shared room, a shared life, finally begun. As they lay in the darkness, the soft sounds of the prairie night drifting in through the open window, Nora reached for Cade's hand, his fingers laced through hers, a familiar, reassuring warmth.
"This time,"
she whispered, a smile in her voice, "the cowboy is not allowed to let the mail get stuck." He chuckled, a low, warm sound in the darkness, and squeezed her hand. "I promise," he said, "every letter delivered." The next morning, Nora took the blue woolen scarf from the peg by the door. She washed it gently and hung it on the line outside. The wind, the same wind that had once been a merciless, howling enemy, now caught the scarf and made it dance. It billowed and swayed in the bright morning sun. No longer a desperate flag of hope in a blizzard, but a banner of peace, a vibrant, joyful signal of a future that had finally, against all odds, arrived. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.